Thank you for downloading this RealAgriculture podcast. Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Bio. Access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Learn more at excitebio.ca. That's XITEBIO.ca.
Bernard Tobin here at the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity Public Trust Summit 2024. I'm joined now by Dr. Samantha Nutt. She is the founder of War Child Canada, physician, philanthropist, global affairs specialist. That's quite a resume, Samantha. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Bernard.
Hey, I want to talk about, I guess, maybe a question that you put on the floor here when we started here. You know, why was a nut called here to talk about the importance of food security systems and public trust?
Yes, those nut jokes just write themselves. I'm actually a practicing public health doctor, and that was my training. I've spent the last almost 3 decades now in that capacity, going in and out of different war-torn environments. And one of the things I talked about, in addition to the work that War Child's doing, which involves a great deal of food security programming throughout the world, we also, as public health, we look at the importance of food and food security and food systems. We're on the other end of that. We are the ones that are devising the policies. We are investigating outbreaks. We're doing all of those things that help to ensure that Canadians have safe access to food, and that's not going to make them sick. So one of the points that I made earlier today is that despite how strange it may seem that I was asked to deliver the keynote, as a public health doctor, as someone who works in the area of food security through my international work, I recognize the importance of what all of you do, and we're part of the same continuum in terms of making sure that people have access to safe, affordable food. Yeah,
and you talked about, your experiences, and many, obviously, all of the starving children impacted that you've seen are impacted by failed food systems.
That's right. It's one of the greatest threats to people's health and well-being throughout the world. It's something that we take for granted here in Canada, but we are facing an unprecedented food security crisis on a global level, with about 50 million people right now at risk of malnutrition and starvation. Sudan, for example, which is another part of the world that I talked about, which has been in a very heavy conflict since April of last year, they have 13 million people right now who are at risk of acute starvation, of famine, just in the next few months. Both sides to that conflict, armed groups, deliberately targeted the food reserves in this war, putting more people at risk, making them increasingly vulnerable. So as a physician, as someone who has worked in famine areas, who has been somebody who's witnessed acute starvation and the chronic effects of malnutrition, I can say with absolute confidence that it is vitally important. It is as important as health, as our economy, as education, as a core Canadian value, because without it, we frankly just will not survive.
How important is that public trust, that confidence? You talked about, you've seen so many things in your travels, and, just feeding people and children is so important. Do we ask too many questions about our food? Do we not have the confidence, the trust that we should have?
I think questions are always important, as long as we are also digging into the answers. You can question things, but then go beyond questioning things to dig into, well, what does our food system look like? The truth is, Canada has one of the safest, most effective, most reliable, professional, regulated food systems, food and food security in the world. And certainly as someone who has seen firsthand what happens when you don't have these systems and structures in place, there is nothing that builds your confidence more in the Canadian food system than seeing in other environments what happens when you don't have the luxury of these kinds of robust systems in place and people who are dedicated to ensuring that we have safe and affordable food. I know that that we in recent years, with the increasing cost of food, people have felt the pressure and the pinch of that. But at the same time, we are still incredibly fortunate to exist in one of the safest food supply jurisdictions in the world.
When you talked to this room earlier today, you mentioned, in this group, trying to cultivate public trust, you said know your stuff. You really have to understand everything from geopolitics to how food moves. There's so much that impacts the trust of food and the availability of food.
And that's exactly right. Understanding why trends are happening and being able to explain that. And one of the examples I gave is it's not enough to really turn around and say, well, if somebody says, well, why are tomatoes $2 more than they were a year ago? To say, well, the price of gas has gone up, and therefore we're having to pass that cost on to consumers. The reality is that price of that tomato is affected by a number of different things. For example, the war in Ukraine, which we might think is quite far removed from any of us here, but the war in Ukraine has affected fertilizer, the availability of fertilizers, which have gone up. It has affected fuel costs, as well as the war in the Middle East, which is causing the price of oil to go up. The war in Sudan, which is causing the price of oil to go up. Issues that are happening as a result of Yemen through the Red Sea and disruptions to shipping containers and shipping supplies. Again, impacting on some of those inputs that we need to be able to bring our goods to market, to be able to farm safely and effectively. So all of these are some of the reasons why we have seen so much inflationary pressure, why we have seen the cost of food going up. So if anybody is coming from within the sector who's trying to explain it to somebody outside of the sector, it is important to know your stuff and to pay attention to all of the things that are happening in the world that could be the reason why you're seeing some of what you're seeing here in Canada. It is more complicated than it seems on the surface.
You talked about, again, with this group, how to build alliances, how to build a system, how to build that confidence. And you said, identify those who are credible and speak with authority. You've obviously had to do that in your all the work that you've done. How can this group do that in the Canadian food system?
You're already experts. You already own a piece of our food system that you are participating in to ensure that Canadians have access to the food that they need, whether you are manufacturing seeds, whether you are farming, whether you are involved in food distribution, whether you are a retailer. You already have a level of expertise, and you are already a critical piece in that particular puzzle. So leverage that. Have confidence in that. It doesn't hurt to have additional conversations and to form strong bonds with other people from different parts of your sector so that you understand their work as well as your own work and can speak to the entire process. But making sure that you are all aligned, that you are communicating your message, that you are instilling confidence in others through your sense of ownership and authority of the issue, those are some of the most important things you can do. If you believe that you know what you're talking about, because you do know what you're talking about, trust me, other people will believe it as well.
Yeah. Hey, final question for you, and that is about, how, I guess, to speak to Canadians about the questions they have about food security and food quality. And you had a question from the floor here asking that. In the context of what you've seen, what you've observed, how do we address questions from Canadians? Again, within the context of what you've seen and observed.
Look, the only way to really promote confidence or to build public trust is through transparency, through consistency, through integrity. So just by having those kinds of conversations, by putting the evidence on the table, by reminding people that for the most part in Canada, we are very fortunate that with very, 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 very rare exceptions, our food does not, in fact, make us sick. And as someone who has been on the front lines of different famines throughout the world, who is in environments where food makes people sick, particularly from diarrheal diseases and dysentery and foodborne outbreaks, who sees that on a regular basis in other environments, it's just, frankly, the starkest reminder of how lucky we are, how privileged we are to live in a place where this system works. And yes, sometimes there can be issues that come up, and we need to learn from those issues. We need to be open about them. We need to be transparent around them and communicate them, and we need to put measures in place that might prevent those kinds of similar outbreaks from occurring again in the future. But remembering that they are very rare outcomes, that we can have confidence, communicating that being honest about that, being transparent about that, that's the way that I think you build public trust, build public confidence, because there's no reason why Canadians shouldn't have absolute confidence in our food system. We live in one of the most food secure countries in the world. There are issues of affordability that need to be addressed, but having confidence when you go to the grocery store that your food is very unlikely to make you sick, that is a tremendous privilege, and that's one that we, I think, can all be very grateful for.
Final thing, let's talk a little bit about warchild.ca. You said, and I quote, "If it's hard, it's because what you are doing is important." Tell us a little bit about warchild.ca. What keeps you busy? I know it's a big job.
Thank you. Well, War Child's an international humanitarian organization, and we work in war zones throughout the world with a focus on children, but also their families. So we do a lot of work with women as well. We're a long-term humanitarian organization, so we work with local communities to ensure that they can rebuild and recover from war, and that's really our expertise. And we do that in the areas of food security, economic development, strengthening the rights, especially of women and girls. And we also do a lot of work around education and catch-up learning so that children and their families can grow and thrive and rebuild and recover and have plans and ambitions and hope and opportunity going forward. So it's a long-term strategy. We have more than 900 staff throughout the world. 99% of them come from those local communities. They're designing and running all of our programs, and we work with about 1 million children and their families every single year. So that's what War Child is in a little bit of a snapshot. We're in some of the most challenging environments in the world. We have extensive programming across parts of Africa, but we're also in Afghanistan, we're in Yemen, and other places. And look, right now, unfortunately, there is a tremendous amount of work to be done. We're experiencing a huge amount of upheaval, an increase in war, in violent hostilities, particularly in many of the places in which we're operating. And so finding out more about what you can do and how you can support those efforts is something that we always welcome. And as you mentioned, the website's warchild.ca.
Wonderful stuff, Samantha. Really want to thank you for making some time for Real Agriculture. Good luck in your endeavors.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all that you do. Honestly, it's been a privilege to be here.